They laughed when the lawyer handed me a crumpled $2 bill while my siblings got houses and jewelry. But when that same lawyer called me 6 months later and said you need to come to my office immediately, everything changed. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Harrison and Associates as I sat in that leather chair, watching my family's faces twist from anticipation to disappointment to outright mockery. My sister Rebecca clutched the deed to grandmother's lake house, her manicured fingers tracing the property lines like she was already planning renovations. My brother Michael held the keys to her vintage Cadillac, spinning them around his finger with that smug smile he'd perfected since childhood. David, the eldest, had inherited her jewelry collection and stock portfolio, worth more than most people see in a lifetime. And then there was me, 28 years old, sitting in my thrift store dress, holding a wrinkled $2 bill that looked like it had been forgotten in someone's junk drawer for decades. Before I continue with what happened that day, I want you to know you're here with me in this moment. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you're tuning in from. I love knowing how far this story reaches, because what I'm about to share changed everything I thought I knew about worth and legacy. The silence in that room was deafening after Mr. Harrison finished reading grandmother's will. Rebecca was the first to break it, her laughter sharp and cutting like broken glass. She looked at me with those cold blue eyes that had dismissed me our entire lives and said, "Sarah, I guess Grandma really knew how much you were worth." The others joined in then, their laughter filling the oak-paneled office like poison in the air. Michael shook his head and muttered something about how fitting it was that the family failure got the family joke of an inheritance. David didn't even look at me, just focused on examining Grandma's emerald brooch like I wasn't even there. Mom sat rigid in her chair, her lips pressed into that thin line of disappointment I'd seen my whole life whenever my name came up in family conversations. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks as I stared down at the faded bill in my hands. The edges were soft from handling, and there was a small tear near one corner that someone had carefully taped years ago. It felt fragile, worthless, like everything else in my life that my family had deemed inadequate. My part-time job at the downtown library barely covered my studio apartment rent. My art, which I'd been pursuing since college, hadn't sold more than a few pieces at local coffee shops. While my siblings had climbed corporate ladders and bought houses in the suburbs, I was still riding the bus and eating ramen most nights. They never let me forget it either, especially at family gatherings where success was measured in salary figures and square footage. Rebecca stood up first, smoothing down her designer suit as she prepared to leave. She paused by my chair and leaned down, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Maybe you can frame it next to your participation trophies," she whispered, her breath cold against my ear. The others were already discussing lunch plans, their voices animated with excitement about their new acquisitions. They talked over me like I wasn't there, making plans to celebrate at the country club where I'd never been invited anyway. Mom gathered her purse and gave me that look, the one that said she was sorry for me but not surprised by how things had turned out. Mr. Harrison remained seated as my family filed out, his weathered hands folded on his mahogany desk. He was an older gentleman, probably in his 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been Grandma's lawyer for as long as I could remember, handling all her affairs with the quiet dignity that seemed to follow him everywhere. After the office door closed behind my family, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something there, something that made me think he wanted to say more, but instead he just asked if I had any questions about the inheritance process. I shook my head, still clutching the $2 bill like it was some kind of lifeline. What was there to ask about? I'd received exactly what my family expected me to receive, which was next to nothing. Mr. Harrison handed me a manila envelope with some paperwork about the estate processing, his fingers lingering on mine for just a moment longer than necessary. He told me to keep his card handy, that sometimes estate matters took time to fully resolve. I nodded and tucked everything into my worn canvas bag, the same one I carried my library books in every day. Walking out of that office into the bright afternoon sun, I felt smaller than I had in years. The city bustled around me with its usual indifference, People rushing past in their business attire while I stood there holding a $2 bill and wondering what Grandma had been thinking. Had this been her final message to me? That I was worth exactly $2 in her eyes? The thought sat heavy in my chest as I waited for the bus that would take me back to my tiny apartment on the wrong side of town. My siblings had already started posting photos on social media. Rebecca's lake house pictures were flooding my feed, showing off the wraparound porch and private dock that she'd probably never actually use. Michael had taken his new Cadillac for a joyride, posting videos of himself behind the wheel with some caption about classic American luxury. David was more subtle, just a photo of Grandma's jewelry laid out on velvet, but the message was clear. They'd inherited substance, history, value. I'd inherited what felt like a cruel joke. That evening in my apartment, I sat at my small kitchen table staring at the bill under the harsh fluorescent light. It was a 1976 series, printed for the bicentennial, but it looked older somehow, like it had lived several lifetimes before ending up in my hands. The serial number was partially faded, and there were tiny marks along the edges that could have been accidental or intentional. I'd never seen Grandma with this bill, never heard her mention it, never had any indication that it held any significance beyond its face value. I thought about calling my siblings, maybe suggesting we meet for coffee so we could talk about Grandma and share memories, but I knew how that would go. They'd spend the whole time talking about their inheritances and their plans, and I'd sit there with my $2 bill feeling like the charity case they'd always seen me as. Instead, I pulled out my phone and looked up $2 bills online, curious if there was anything special about mine. Most of what I found talked about how they were still legal tender but rarely circulated, how some people collected them, how they were often mistaken for fake money. The apartment felt especially quiet that night, with just the hum of my ancient refrigerator and the occasional sound of my upstairs neighbor walking around. I'd been living there for 3 years, ever since my last relationship ended, and I couldn't afford anything better on my library salary. The walls were thin enough that I could hear conversations through them, and the heater only worked sporadically, but it was mine. Sort of. The landlord was understanding about my sometimes late rent payments, which was more than I could say for most people in my life. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on as darkness settled over the neighborhood. My art supplies were scattered across the small table I used as a desk, watercolors and brushes and half-finished paintings that nobody would ever see. This was my world, small and quiet and apparently worth about $2 to the people who were supposed to love me most. The thought made my chest tight with a familiar ache, the same feeling I'd carried since childhood whenever my achievements were dismissed or my dreams were called impractical. Grandma had always been different from the rest of them, though. She'd lived in that big house on Maple Street for as long as I could remember, but she'd often disappear for weeks at a time on what she called business trips. None of us really knew what kind of business a widow in her 80s could have, but she'd always come back with stories and sometimes small gifts for us grandchildren. She'd been the only one who never made me feel ashamed of my choices, who'd sit and listen when I talked about my art or my dreams of maybe having a gallery showing someday. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd shown me the most kindness had left me the least valuable inheritance. Maybe that was her way of telling me something. Or maybe she'd simply run out of meaningful things to give by the time the will got to my name. I tried not to think too hard about it, but the hurt sat there anyway, a small knot of disappointment that I couldn't quite swallow down. I decided to frame the $2 bill, not because Rebecca had suggested it mockingly, but because it was the last thing Grandma had touched with my name on it. I found an old picture frame in my closet, something I'd used for an art school certificate years ago, and carefully placed the bill inside. It looked lonely in there, surrounded by all that empty matting, but at least it was preserved. I hung it on the wall next to my easel where I'd see it every day, a reminder of whatever message Grandma had been trying to send. The weeks that followed were difficult in ways I hadn't expected. My siblings were busy with their new acquisitions, Rebecca planning renovations on the lake house, Michael getting the Cadillac appraised and serviced, David having grandma's jewelry evaluated for insurance purposes. They talked about these things at family dinners with an excitement that made my chest hurt. I contributed what I could to conversations, but what was there to say about a $2 bill? I'd framed it, it looked nice on my wall, end of story. Mom would give me those pitying looks across the dinner table, the kind that said she felt sorry for me but also thought this was somehow fitting. I'd always been the odd one out in our family, the one who chose art over business, creativity over security, dreams over what they called realistic expectations. In their minds, my small inheritance was just another confirmation that I'd made the wrong choices my whole life. They never said it directly, but the implication hung in the air like smoke that never quite cleared. The library where I worked became my refuge during those weeks. Surrounded by books and quiet patrons, I could lose myself in organizing returns and helping people find the stories they were looking for. Mrs. Chin, the head librarian, had been kind to me since I'd started working there, always encouraging my artistic pursuits and never making me feel like my part-time status was a failure. She'd noticed I seemed down lately and had started bringing me extra tea during my breaks, small gestures of kindness that meant more than she probably knew. I threw myself into my art during the evenings, working on a series of watercolor landscapes that captured the changing light in my neighborhood throughout the day. Painting had always been my way of processing emotions I couldn't quite name, and there was something therapeutic about watching colors blend and flow across the paper. These paintings were different from my earlier work, more contemplative and maybe a little sadder, but they felt honest in a way that my previous pieces hadn't. One evening while I was cleaning my brushes, I noticed the $2 bill in its frame catching the lamplight in an interesting way. There was something about the way the shadows fell across it that made me want to paint it, to capture that moment of quiet dignity it seemed to possess despite its humble nature. I started sketching at first, paying attention to the details I'd overlooked before, the careful printing and the way the paper had aged to a soft ivory color. As I worked on the sketch, I found myself thinking about Grandma again, remembering conversations we'd had over the years. She'd always been interested in my art, asking to see my latest pieces and offering gentle encouragement when I was feeling discouraged. She told me once that real value wasn't always visible on the surface, that some of the most precious things in life were the ones that required patience to appreciate. At the time, I thought she was just being kind, trying to make me feel better about my unconventional choices. Now, sitting in my small apartment with her final gift framed on my wall, I wondered if there had been more meaning in her words than I'd realized. The $2 bill might not have monetary value beyond its face amount, but it represented something else, something I was still trying to understand. Maybe it was her way of telling me that my worth wasn't determined by what others thought I deserved. Or maybe it was a reminder that value came in forms that couldn't always be measured in dollars and cents. The sketch of the bill turned into a full painting over several evenings, and I found myself paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. The serial numbers, the tiny imperfections in the printing, the way someone had carefully repaired that small tear with nearly invisible tape. Each element seemed intentional somehow, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. When I finished the painting, I stepped back and looked at both the original bill and my artistic interpretation of it, feeling like I was missing something important. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Something was nagging at me, a feeling that I couldn't shake no matter how much I tried to rationalize it away. I kept thinking about Grandma's mysterious business trips, about the way Mr. Harrison had looked at me in his office, about the careful way someone had repaired that tear in the bill. None of it made complete sense, but it felt connected somehow, like threads of a story I couldn't quite see the pattern of yet. I got up and made myself another cup of tea, standing by the window and looking out at the empty street. The city was quiet at this hour, just the occasional car passing by and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. My reflection looked back at me from the glass, tired and uncertain, holding a mug that had seen better days just like everything else in my small world. I thought about my siblings sleeping peacefully in their nice houses, secure in their valuable inheritances, probably not giving Grandma or her final wishes another thought. The $2 bill seemed to watch me from its frame, and I found myself wondering about its history before it came to me. Where had Grandma gotten it? Why had she kept it all these years? Why had she chosen to leave it specifically to me when she could have just included it with one of the other inheritances? The questions multiplied in my mind like ripples in a pond, each one leading to more questions I couldn't answer. I was about to go back to bed when my phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet apartment. The caller ID showed Harrison and Associates, which seemed impossible at this hour. Who would be calling from a law office at nearly midnight? I hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was some kind of mistake or maybe a wrong number, but something compelled me to answer. Mr. Harrison's voice was clear and urgent on the other end of the line, more animated than I'd ever heard him sound. "Miss Sarah," he said, "I know it's late, but I need you to come to my office first thing in the morning. There's something about your grandmother's estate that we need to discuss, something that couldn't wait for regular business hours." His tone sent a chill down my spine, not of fear exactly, but of anticipation mixed with confusion. I asked him what this was about, but he was cryptic in his response. He said it had to do with my inheritance, with the $2 bill specifically, and that there were aspects of your grandmother's final wishes that I'm only now authorized to share with you. The way he said authorized made it sound like there had been conditions attached to Grandma's will that I didn't know about, secrets that were only now coming to light. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen chair staring at the $2 bill in its frame, feeling like I was standing on the edge of something enormous that I couldn't yet see. The quiet apartment suddenly felt charged with possibility, like the air before a thunderstorm when everything holds its breath waiting for the lightning to strike. Whatever Mr. Harrison needed to tell me, whatever secrets Grandma had kept hidden, I had the feeling that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even imagine. I spent the rest of the night awake, watching the sky slowly lighten outside my window and wondering what the morning would bring. The $2 bill continued to catch the changing light, and I swear I could see something in it that I'd missed before, some detail or marking that seemed to shimmer just at the edge of my vision. By the time the sun was fully up, I was dressed and ready to discover what my grandmother had really left me. What truth had been hidden behind that crumpled piece of currency that my family had dismissed so cruelly? The walk to Mr. Harrison's office felt different that morning, charged with anticipation and the strange certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The receptionist at Harrison and Associates looked surprised to see me so early, her coffee still steaming on her desk as she unlocked the front door. Mr. Harrison was waiting for me in his office, but he looked different somehow, more alert and purposeful than I'd ever seen him. He gestured for me to sit in the same leather chair where I'd received my inheritance just 6 months ago, but this time he closed the door behind us and drew the blinds, creating an atmosphere of secrecy that made my heart race. "Sarah," he began, settling behind his mahogany desk with a thick manila folder I'd never seen before, "what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about your grandmother and your inheritance." He opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk, legal papers with official seals and letterheads from companies I didn't recognize. "Your grandmother, Eleanor Matthews, was not the simple widow your family believed her to be. She was one of the most successful businesswomen of her generation, and she built an empire that spans 3 decades and multiple industries." I stared at him in confusion, my hands gripping the arms of the chair. That was impossible. Grandma had lived in the same modest house on Maple Street my entire life, drove an old car until the very end, dressed simply, and never displayed any signs of wealth beyond what a comfortable retirement might provide. Mr. Harrison must have seen the disbelief in my eyes because he reached for a photograph from the folder, sliding it across the desk toward me. The black and white photo showed a younger version of my grandmother, maybe in her 50s, standing in front of a gleaming office building with her name etched in gold letters above the entrance. Eleanor Matthews Enterprises, the sign read, and she was surrounded by men in expensive suits who were clearly deferring to her authority. She looked confident and powerful in a way I'd never seen her, wearing a tailored business suit and holding herself with the bearing of someone who commanded respect in boardrooms across the country. This was taken in 1987, Mr. Harrison explained, when she opened her third regional headquarters. By that time, she owned construction companies, real estate development firms, and had significant holdings in emerging technology companies that would later become household names. She was brilliant at seeing opportunities before others recognized them, and she had an instinct for business that was almost supernatural in its accuracy. But why? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Why did she live so simply? Why didn't any of us know about this? Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. Because, Sarah, she was testing all of you. She wanted to see who would love her for herself, not for what she could provide. She watched your family for years, observing how they treated her and how they treated each other, especially how they treated you. He pulled out another document, this one typed on official letterhead with my grandmother's signature at the bottom. This is her real will, he said, the one that matters. The document your family heard 6 months ago was what she called her testing phase. She wanted to see their true reactions, their genuine character when they thought the stakes were low. She wanted to observe how they would treat the person who received what appeared to be the least valuable inheritance. I felt dizzy as I tried to process what he was telling me. The cruel laughter of my siblings, their dismissive comments, their complete lack of compassion for what they thought was my disappointment, all of it had been observed and evaluated by Grandma even after her death. She had orchestrated the entire scenario to reveal their true natures, and I had been the unwitting test subject in her final experiment. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice gentle but firm. Eleanor left specific instructions about how this revelation should unfold. She wanted you to experience their treatment firsthand, to understand exactly how they viewed you when they thought there were no consequences for their cruelty. She believed that you needed to see their true characters before you could make informed decisions about your future relationship with them. But the $2 bill, I managed to say, what does that have to do with any of this? He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen on his face since this conversation began. That, my dear, is not just any $2 bill. It's a 1976 bicentennial note, but more importantly, it's the key to your real inheritance. Your grandmother had it specially marked with invisible ink that shows up only under ultraviolet light. The serial number corresponds to a safety deposit box that contains the documentation for everything she's left you. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small UV light, the kind used to detect counterfeit money. Under the purple glow, faint markings appeared on my $2 bill, numbers and symbols that had been completely invisible under normal light. The careful repair tape I'd noticed wasn't random damage. It was covering one of the hidden marks to protect it. Every detail I'd attributed to age and where had actually been deliberately placed there by my grandmother. Sarah, he said, putting the UV light away, you are now the sole owner of Eleanor Matthews Enterprises and all its subsidiary companies. The construction firms, the real estate holdings, the technology investments, the offshore accounts, everything. Your grandmother's estate is worth approximately $240 million, and it's all yours. The room seemed to spin around me as I tried to comprehend what he'd just said. $240 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like something from a movie rather than my actual life. I thought about my tiny apartment, my part-time job at the library, my struggles to pay rent and buy groceries, and none of it seemed real anymore. But why me? I asked, my voice shaking. Why not divide it among all of us? Why not give it to Rebecca or Michael or David? They're the successful ones, the ones who understand business and money. Mr. Harrison's expression grew warm, almost paternal. Because, he said, you were the only one who never asked her for anything. You were the only one who visited her because you enjoyed her company, not because you wanted something from her. You were the only one who shared your dreams with her without expecting her to fund them. He pulled out a letter from the folder, yellowed with age and written in Grandma's careful handwriting. She wrote this for you to read when you learned the truth, he said, handing it across the desk. I took it with trembling fingers, recognizing her familiar script even though the words were blurry through my tears. My dearest Sarah, the letter began. If you are reading this, then you have discovered what I spent 40 years building in secret. I created this empire not for the luxury it could provide, but for the security it could offer to someone who would use it wisely. I watched your siblings grow into adults who measured worth in dollars and status, who treated kindness as weakness and compassion as stupidity. But you, my sweet girl, you remained gentle in a world that tried to harden you. I continued reading, tears flowing freely now as Grandma's words explained her reasoning. You chose art over profit, beauty over acquisition, love over advantage. When your siblings visited me, they talked about their achievements and their possessions. When you visited, you asked about my health and shared your paintings with me. You never once asked me for money, even when I knew you were struggling. You never treated me like a bank account with legs, the way the others did. The letter went on to explain her business philosophy, how she'd started with nothing after my grandfather died and built her empire through careful planning and calculated risks. She'd reinvested everything back into the companies, living modestly so that no one would suspect the true scope of her success. She'd wanted to leave a legacy that would make a difference in the world, not just fund another generation of entitled spending. Your inheritance comes with responsibility, the letter continued. This money isn't for buying bigger houses or faster cars. It's for creating something meaningful, something that will outlast both of us. I trust you to use it wisely because you're the only one who ever saw me as a person rather than a source of potential wealth. You're the only one who inherited my values along with my money. Mr. Harrison waited patiently while I finished reading, occasionally passing me tissues from a box on his desk. When I finally looked up, he was studying my face with the same careful attention I imagined Grandma had paid to my siblings' reactions 6 months ago. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. I laughed, but it came out shaky and uncertain. "Overwhelmed," I said. "Terrified. Grateful. Confused. All of it at once." He nodded understandingly. "Eleanor predicted you would react this way. She said you would worry about the responsibility more than celebrate the wealth, which is exactly why she chose you." He reached for another document from the folder. "She also left detailed instructions about how she wanted you to handle the revelation to your family. She believed they deserved to know the truth, but she wanted you to be the one to decide when and how to tell them." The thought of facing my siblings with this news made my stomach clench with anxiety. How do you tell people who had laughed at your $2 inheritance that you were actually now worth more than all of them combined? How do you explain that their cruelty had been observed and judged, that their mockery had disqualified them from the very fortune they'd assumed they deserved? Mr. Harrison seemed to read my thoughts. "She suggested starting with a family dinner," he said. "Something casual where you can share the news in a controlled environment. She believed that seeing their reactions would help you understand how to proceed with your relationships going forward. Some people, when confronted with their mistakes, choose to make amends. Others become more bitter and resentful. She wanted you to see which category your family members fall into." I thought about Rebecca's sharp laughter, Michael's dismissive shaking of his head, David's complete indifference to my presence. Would they be happy for me, or would they be angry that they'd missed out on what they consider their rightful share? Would they apologize for their treatment, or would they find ways to justify their behavior and blame me for Grandma's decision? The next few hours passed in a blur as Mr. Harrison walked me through the details of my inheritance. There were corporate headquarters to visit, board meetings to attend, decisions to make about the future direction of various companies. Eleanor Matthews Enterprises employed over 3,000 people across multiple states, and they were all depending on leadership decisions that would now come from me. He handed me a key to the executive offices downtown, a building I'd walked past hundreds of times without ever imagining I had any connection to it. "Your grandmother's personal office has been maintained exactly as she left it," he said. "She requested that you spend some time there before making any major decisions, that you get a feel for the empire she built and the vision she had for its future." By the time I left his office that afternoon, My canvas bag was heavy with documents, keys, and financial statements that represented a life I couldn't quite believe was mine. The sun seemed brighter as I walked down the street. The city looked different somehow, like I was seeing it through new eyes. I own buildings here, I realized. I employed people who walked these same sidewalks. I had responsibilities and power and resources that I'd never imagined possible. But more than anything, I felt the weight of Grandma's trust. She had chosen me not because I was the most qualified or the most ambitious, but because I was the kindest. She had built something magnificent and placed it in my hands because she believed I would use it for good. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, a burden and a blessing that would change everything about how I lived my life. I decided to visit the executive offices before going home, to see this empire that was now mine. The building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the heart of downtown, with Eleanor Matthews Enterprises etched in gold letters across the front entrance. The security guard recognized my name when I showed him the key Mr. Harrison had given me, and he escorted me to a private elevator that led directly to the executive floor. Grandma's office was a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Her desk was still organized with the same careful precision I remembered from her home, papers sorted into neat stacks and her favorite fountain pen lying beside a leather-bound appointment book. Family photos lined one wall, including several of me at various ages, painting at my easel or reading in her garden. I sat in her chair and tried to imagine her here, conducting business meetings and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. It felt surreal to think that the woman who had taught me how to paint watercolor flowers and who had always listened patiently to my dreams had also been running a corporate empire with skill and determination that rivaled any CEO in the country. There was a knock on the office door, and a well-dressed woman in her 40s entered carrying a thick binder. "Miss Matthews," she said, and I realized she was addressing me by my grandmother's name. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, your grandmother's executive assistant. She asked me to prepare this briefing for you when you were ready to learn about the companies. She's been waiting for this day for years, planning every detail of your transition into leadership." Jennifer spent the next 2 hours walking me through the various businesses, explaining their operations and introducing me to key personnel via conference calls. There were construction companies that specialized in affordable housing, technology firms that developed educational software, and real estate holdings that included both commercial properties and low-income housing developments. Everything Grandma had built served a dual purpose, generating profit while also addressing social needs. It was nearly evening when I finally made it back to my apartment, my head spinning with information and my heart full of emotions I couldn't quite name. The $2 bill in its frame looked different now, no longer a symbol of my family's dismissal, but a key that had unlocked a future I'd never dared to imagine. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at it, thinking about Grandma's careful planning and her faith in my character. I knew I had to tell my family, but I also knew that nothing would ever be the same between us after I did. The cruel laughter in Mr. Harrison's office 6 months ago had created a wound that money couldn't heal, a revelation about their true feelings that I could never unsee. But Grandma was right. They deserved to know the truth, and I deserved to see how they would respond when they learned what their mockery had cost them. I pulled out my phone and started composing a text message to my siblings, inviting them to dinner at Mom's house this weekend. I told them I had some news to share about Grandma's estate, something important that had come to light. As I hit send, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread, knowing that I was about to step into a conversation that would change our family dynamics forever. The $2 bill caught the lamplight one more time as I prepared for bed, and I could swear I saw Grandma's smile reflected in its worn surface. She had given me more than money, I realized. She had given me the truth about the people I'd spent my life trying to please, and the power to decide what kind of relationships I wanted to have going forward. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of becoming Eleanor Matthews' granddaughter in full, but tonight I was still Sarah, the artist with the $2 inheritance, savoring these last few hours before everything changed completely. The phone buzzed with responses from my siblings, all of them agreeing to the dinner with varying degrees of curiosity and mild annoyance at having to rearrange their weekend plans. None of them could have guessed that they were agreeing to attend the most important family meeting of our lives, the one where they would learn exactly how much their cruelty had revealed about their characters and exactly how much that revelation had cost them. Sunday dinner at Mom's house felt different as I walked up the familiar front steps, carrying a leather briefcase that contained documents that would shatter everything my family thought they knew about our grandmother and about me. The same dining room where I'd endured years of subtle dismissals and comparisons now held the potential for the most important conversation of our lives. Rebecca was already there, her designer handbag placed carefully on the sideboard like a territorial marker, while Michael examined his reflection in the china cabinet glass, adjusting his expensive watch with the casual arrogance I'd grown up watching. David arrived precisely on time as always, his BMW pulling into the driveway with the soft purr of German engineering that he loved to mention in casual conversation. Mom bustled around the kitchen with nervous energy, arranging the good china and asking repeatedly if anyone needed anything, her way of avoiding whatever tension she sensed building in the air. They all looked at me with mild curiosity when I placed the briefcase beside my chair, probably wondering why the family failure was carrying around business documents like she had important matters to attend to. The conversation during dinner was predictably focused on their achievements and acquisitions. Rebecca spent 20 minutes describing the renovations she was planning for Grandma's lake house, complete with professional interior designers and a landscaping crew that specialized in waterfront properties. Michael regaled us with stories about taking the vintage Cadillac to car shows, where collectors had approached him with offers that made him feel vindicated in his inheritance. David discussed the insurance appraisal on Grandma's jewelry collection with the satisfaction of someone who'd received exactly what he'd expected to receive. Mom listened to all of this with the proud smile she reserved for her successful children, occasionally glancing at me with that familiar expression of gentle pity mixed with resignation. I contributed what I could to the conversation, asking appropriate questions and making supportive comments, all while feeling the weight of the documents in my briefcase and the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. The $2 bill was in there too, in its frame, ready to play its role in the most dramatic family moment any of us had ever experienced. As Mom served dessert, I took a deep breath and reached for my briefcase. "I have something to share with all of you," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected it to be. "Something about Grandma's estate that I learned this week." Rebecca looked up from her coffee with mild interest, while Michael and David barely paused in their conversation about investment strategies. They were all so comfortable in their assumptions about my place in the family hierarchy that they couldn't imagine I had anything significant to contribute to a discussion about wealth or inheritance. I pulled out the original will, the real one that Mr. Harrison had shown me, and placed it on the table where everyone could see it. "This is Grandma's actual will," I said, "the one that contains her true final wishes." The document we heard 6 months ago was what she called a testing phase, designed to observe our reactions and help her make final decisions about how to distribute her real estate. The silence that followed was different from the one in Mr. Harrison's office 6 months ago. This wasn't the silence of disappointment or mockery, but the silence of confusion and growing unease. Rebecca was the first to speak, her voice sharp with suspicion. "What are you talking about, Sarah? We already went through all this. We already know what Grandma left to home. What game are you trying to play here?" I opened the will to the page that listed the actual bequests and turned it so they could read it. "According to this document," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, "Eleanor Matthews left the entirety of her business empire, valued at approximately $240 million, to me. The lake house, the car, and the jewelry were never part of her actual estate. They were props, temporary gifts designed to test your characters and gauge your reactions to what you believed was my insignificant inheritance." The reactions were immediate and visceral. Rebecca's coffee cup clattered against her saucer as her hand began to shake. Michael's face went pale, then flushed red as the implications of what I'd said began to sink in. David simply stared at the document like he could change the words by looking at them hard enough. Mom's mouth fell open in a way that might have been comical under different circumstances. "You're lying," Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. "This is some kind of sick joke, some way of getting back at us for something. There's no way Grandma had that kind of money. We would have known. We would have seen signs of it." Her protests sounded desperate even to her own ears, the last attempt of someone trying to deny a reality that was too overwhelming to accept. I pulled out the photographs Mr. Harrison had shown me, the ones of Grandma in her business suit standing in front of corporate headquarters with her name etched in gold above the entrances. I spread them across the dining room table like evidence in a court case, each image contradicting everything they thought they knew about the woman who had raised me to value kindness over profit. "She built Eleanor Matthews Enterprises over 40 years, I explained, watching their faces as they processed the photographic evidence. "Construction companies, real estate development, technology investments, offshore holdings. She lived simply because she wanted to see who would love her for herself, not for what she could provide. She wanted to observe how you would treat the person who appeared to receive the least, because she believed that revealed your true characters." David was the first to recover his composure, his lawyer's training kicking in as he examined the documents with professional skepticism. "Even if this is real," he said, his voice cold and calculating, "there would have to be legal challenges. Undue influence, mental incapacity, failure to follow proper procedures. No court would uphold a will based on some kind of psychological test." I reached into the briefcase and pulled out additional documentation, legal opinions from 3 different law firms confirming the validity of Grandma's will and the legitimacy of her testing process. "Mr. Harrison anticipated your concerns," I said, handing the papers to David. "Everything was done according to the letter of the law, with multiple witnesses and psychological evaluations confirming Grandma's mental competency throughout the entire process." The room fell silent again as David read through the legal opinions, his expression growing more strained with each page. His professional expertise was telling him what he didn't want to hear, that the will was airtight and his chances of successfully challenging it were essentially non-existent. The woman he dismissed as a simple widow had outmaneuvered him legally and ethically, using his own expertise against him. "But why?" Mom whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why would she do something so elaborate, so cruel?" "She wasn't cruel," I replied, pulling out Grandma's letter and reading aloud the passage about watching us grow up and seeing who developed genuine character versus who became focused solely on material success. She wanted to leave her legacy to someone who would use it responsibly, someone who had proven their values through their actions rather than their words. Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a harsh sound that made everyone flinch. "This is insane," he said, beginning to pace around the dining room like a caged animal. "You're telling us that Grandma was some kind of secret millionaire who was testing us this whole time? That she gave us temporary gifts just to see how we'd treat you? That everything we received was basically charity while you got the real prize?" I nodded, feeling surprisingly calm despite the emotional storm building around me. "The $2 bill you all laughed at," I said, pulling it from its frame and placing it on the table, "was the key to everything. It has markings visible only under ultraviolet light that correspond to safety deposit boxes containing the complete documentation of her empire. She chose it specifically because she knew you would dismiss it as worthless, just like you dismissed me." Rebecca's composure finally cracked completely. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob, not the elegant tears of someone gracefully processing disappointment, but the raw, ugly crying of someone whose entire self-concept was collapsing in real time. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. We were horrible to you. We were cruel and dismissive, and we didn't deserve anything she gave us." Her apology hung in the air like a confession, and I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness that surprised me with its intensity. This was what Grandma had wanted me to see, how they would react when confronted with the consequences of their behavior. Rebecca's remorse seemed genuine. born from recognition of how badly she'd misjudged both Grandma and me. Michael's reaction was different, angrier and more defensive. "So what now?" he demanded, stopping his pacing to glare at me across the table. "You're going to lord this over us for the rest of our lives? You're going to remind us every day how we failed Grandma's little test? How we weren't good enough to inherit her precious empire?" His pain was manifesting as aggression, a common response from someone who couldn't bear to examine their own behavior too closely. I shook my head, surprised by how peaceful I felt despite his hostility. "I'm not going to lord anything over anyone," I said quietly. "Grandma left me more than money. She left me the truth about who you all really are when you think there are no consequences for cruelty. What I do with that knowledge is up to me, and what you do with this revelation is up to you." David H. had finished reading the legal documents and set them down with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain control in an uncontrollable situation. "The will is valid," he said, his voice flat and professional. "Every possible challenge has been anticipated and addressed." Eleanor Matthews was apparently as brilliant at legal strategy as she was at business development. He looked at me with something that might have been respect mixed with calculation. "What are your plans for the companies?" I explained Grandma's vision as Mr. Harrison and Jennifer had described it to me: the focus on affordable housing and educational technology, the commitment to using business success to address social needs. I talked about the 3,000 employees depending on wise leadership decisions, about the responsibility I felt to honor Grandma's legacy while also making the empire my own. As I spoke, I watched my family's faces processing not just the magnitude of what I'd inherited, but the type of person Grandma had believed me to be. She had entrusted me with something that could change thousands of lives, not because I was the smartest or most ambitious, but because I was the kindest. The weight of that trust was both humbling and empowering. Mom had been quiet throughout most of the conversation, but now she reached across the table and took my hand. "I failed you, sweetheart," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I let them treat you like you were less important, less valuable, less worthy of respect. I measured success by the wrong standards, and I taught them to do the same thing. I'm proud of who you've become despite how we raised you, not because of it." Her acknowledgement of the family dynamics that had shaped my entire childhood felt like a gift almost as valuable as Grandma's inheritance. For the first time in my life, my mother was seeing me clearly, recognizing the strength it had taken to maintain my values in an environment that constantly questioned them. The conversation continued for another hour, with tears and apologies and difficult admissions about years of family dysfunction that had been hidden beneath a veneer of middle-class respectability. Rebecca committed to examining her own behavior and making changes in how she treated people she perceived as less successful. Michael struggled more with the revelation, swinging between anger and remorse as he processed the implications. David surprised me by asking thoughtful questions about my plans for the business empire, offering his legal expertise to help with the transition despite his obvious disappointment about his own reduced inheritance. Perhaps his professional training was helping him separate personal feelings from practical considerations, or perhaps he was genuinely interested in redemption. As the evening wound down, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. Grandma had given me more than wealth. She had given me clarity about my family relationships and the power to choose how to proceed with full knowledge of everyone's true character. Some bridges could be rebuilt with effort and genuine change. Others might need to remain burned for my own emotional health. Walking back to my apartment that night, I thought about the conversation I would have with Mr. Harrison the next morning about beginning my transition into corporate leadership. I thought about the 3,000 employees who would be depending on my decisions, about the affordable housing projects that needed funding, about the educational software that could change children's lives. The $2 bill was back in its frame, but now it represented something entirely different. Not the cruel joke my family had thought it was, but the key to a future filled with purpose and responsibility. Grandma had seen something in me that I was only beginning to see in myself, a capacity for leadership that had nothing to do with traditional measures of success. My phone buzzed with text messages from my siblings as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. Rebecca asking if we could have coffee soon to talk more about rebuilding our relationship. Michael apologizing again and asking for time to process everything he'd learned. David offering to help with legal aspects of the corporate transition. Even Mom had sent a message telling me how proud she was and how sorry she was for the years of subtle dismissal. I sat at my kitchen table and looked around my tiny apartment, knowing that I could afford to live anywhere now, but not sure I wanted to leave this place that had been my refuge during the hardest years. The empire Grandma had built would require an office downtown and business attire and decisions. That affected thousands of lives, but this little space with its thin walls and temperamental heater had shaped me into the person she'd believed worthy of that responsibility. The framed $2 bill caught the lamplight one last time, and I could almost see Grandma's approving smile in its worn surface. She had spent 40 years building something magnificent, not for the luxury it could provide, but for the good it could accomplish in the right hands. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of proving myself worthy of her faith, of using her gift to create the kind of legacy she had envisioned. But to Nick, I was still Sarah the artist, sitting in her small apartment, surrounded by watercolor paintings and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that kindness had finally been rewarded, that gentle strength had triumphed over loud ambition, and that sometimes the people who appear to have the least actually have the most to offer the world. The $2 bill had taught my family a lesson about the difference between surface value and true worth, and now it would remind me every day that the most precious inheritances are not the ones measured in dollars, but the ones measured in the positive impact we have on other people's lives. I want to know you were here for this journey with me. Drop a comment and tell me what this story meant to you, because sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones that teach us to see beyond appearances and recognize the quiet strength that changes the world one act of kindness at a time.